normal. I think that there were a lot of jets flying that day because there were many going in the same direction, leaving parallel lines. And in subsequent days, I would see many jets flying where the lines were parallel, and there would be 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 all leaving trails at one time up the east side. And so they would move around the county in kind of a clock-like, moving around a clock. Later, we discovered from talking to people in different counties that they were looping out over the Pacific Ocean and then coming back in, and they were doing these huge loops. Discovered that from the size of one plume and watching one plume expand, that they could cover our skies in solid cloud cover in about 3 hours here in Mendocino County. That there was something wrong with this picture. I had never seen anything like this in my entire lifetime. My mother, who was in her 80s at the time, I showed her and she said, "I've never seen anything like that in all the years I've lived here. Nothing." Began to realize that there was a brand new phenomenon that was occurring in which jet contrails, instead of dissipating relatively quickly if you saw them in a few seconds, began to persist and grow. And NASA studies proved that they turned into man-made clouds that would change the climate, exacerbate global warming, impact natural resources. NASA, first of all, in the late 1980s, initiated a schools program for children K through 12. And they started in some foreign countries, and then they brought the program to the United States. And NASA began to have children starting to count contrails because they said that they're satellites and also that they couldn't count them from the ground. So therefore, they needed school children to do this as part of a kind of like a game. I think that they really began to want children to think that this was a normal phenomenon. And so in the late 1980s, this program started to go through. When we offered to give our videotapes and our pictures and called up NASA and said, "Look, we'll provide this because we've done day-to-day, time, date, everything on the pictures and on the videotapes." And NASA turned us down because school children, as they put it, were more reliable. That's what I was told. So then the second thing I found out by calling the National Weather Service, and I would ask them, "Are you on, online, are you looking at the satellite?" And they said yes. And I said, "Can you look over Ukiah?" And they said yes. And I said, "Well, can you see a jet, leaving a plume?" And so I was on the phone with them, and I found that within a few seconds, if a jet leaves a plume and it starts to get a little bit larger, not real small, but a little bit larger, they can see the plume expanding. And we were talking about the same one that was going right over Ukiah, and the plume was expanding. And I said, "Well, how come in your weather reports you don't talk about this as man-made clouds or persistent jet contrails? How come you're talking about this as being a front, a weather front?" And they said, "Well, that's the way we deal with it because it's clouds. So we look at it that this is being, a weather front is coming through and this would produce these clouds." Well, I said, "But it's not being produced by a weather front. The barometer is not dropping. There's nothing going on." I said, "How come you don't just use the terminology?" And he said, "Well, we just don't." Well, if they're seeing all this, why isn't it being reported? And it's curious because no weathermen will talk about it. If Ukiah was, the sun was occluded and all these man-made clouds appeared over Ukiah and covered the whole thing after 3 hours, they would say, "Well, it was a front." But you could look to the west and there was no cloud, and the barometer hadn't dropped. There was no cloud front coming in from the Pacific. There was none from any direction. And yet we were covered over in this man-made clouds and things. Hey, where we talk about geoengineering. The interesting part of geoengineering is that it's now being proposed as a way to put particulates in the atmosphere so that we can stop the direct sunlight from reaching the Earth. It means that they could add particles, iron particles to the ocean. That's another form of geoengineering. in other words, when you have jets that change the climate, that's another form of man-made geoengineering. So geoengineering means something that you're going to do in the atmosphere that would not normally be happening on any normal type of basis. In other words, a volcano would be normal. The particulates coming up from a volcano, for example, would be a normal phenomenon, and then we would take whatever consequences comes from that. However, when you start taking and talking about, as Holdren is, he's Obama's science advisor, talking about taking care of global warming, in other words, by putting particles in the air, like sulfur or some other particles, then that means that we're going to take some action where we're going to try to interfere with some normal processes that are going on. And the problem with this, for example, with sulfur, is that sulfur, in the sense of it, we took it out of diesel fuel in California in 2006. And we said we have to clean it up because kids get asthma from sulfur, lots of health problems associated with too much sulfur in diesel fuel. We take it out of diesel fuel, and then someone says, comes along, like Paul Crutzen, and he says, we're going to put it up in the atmosphere to obscure the sunlight, so less sunlight reaches the earth, and therefore that will cool us down. But what about the health effects? If you have to take it out of diesel fuel, then my question is, why are you going to put up something that's not helpful into the atmosphere and try to change the process that we live under? And that's what geoengineering is. And you can look at every drinking water test taken since 1972 in the state of California. I cannot tell you how many tests this amounts to, because every month, every week, they're taking tests all the time, all over the state, different utilities, different districts. I began to look at, was there anything showing up in all the drinking water spikes across California on a pretty consistent level? Initially, I looked for things like barium, aluminum, manganese, magnesium, calcium. I looked at what the pH of the water was to see if I could find any blips in pH. But what I discovered was that during the course of the year, starting in 1990, no less, that the water sources were all registering unusual spikes. Now, they weren't spiking just alone. Almost every water test in the state of California was showing spikes in a certain year and a certain month for certain of these chemicals. Somebody somewhere was beginning to use inordinate amounts of arsenic, barium, aluminum, calcium, manganese, magnesium, and that all of these things, lead, iron, were all spiking at the same time. How can you have them spiking in the same time across the entire state of California when prior to the 1990s, and they were testing for these chemicals prior to the 1990s, that they weren't showing up in water systems at all? A friend of mine took and graphed every single water district, every single piece of data, and we now have a graphing program so we can look at any water system in California, and we can determine if they were spiking in unison with any other water system across the state of California. It took 300 hours to write a program to do this. The government has not expressed any interest, nor have elected officials, in actually putting the subject to rest by testing these plumes either. So what they do is NASA, NOAA, a lot of studies, university studies, they look at these plumes and say, yes, these are man-made clouds. They don't say how they turn into man-made clouds, if it's chemical or whatever. And then they discuss the fact that in these clouds, that it's causing certain types of problems, covering us in cloud cover, dimming the sun, and then it's changing our climate and negatively impacting natural resources. A jet would fly in leaving a contrail, and then all of a sudden you'd see this huge burst, no contrail leaving, but you would get this kind of configuration. And I go, well, what happened here? Why did this create a burst which then expands for miles and miles and miles over the sky above us? And why would this part of the trail turn into this type of configuration? So this was odd. What happens? Why would you get different types? And so the standard answer is, well, there's different atmospheric conditions. But then we found that one jet would lay a short contrail, another jet right behind it would be leaving one that turned into a huge plume, another one would leave white haze. So we're saying it can't be just atmospheric conditions, there has to be something else going on. Then we saw X's and stop and goes, where a jet like this would leave a plume and then all of a sudden it would stop. What we see from the ground is we'll see a plume and then it expands. And the satellite pictures do show, and I have a lot of them, other people have a lot of them, we've seen them, do show the contrails and they show the cross-hatching. They show that they're expanding. You can watch them over time on satellite pictures and you can see as there's flights going around over certain areas that they expand. So we can see them. So they can see them from space, they can see them from the ground. So that there's no secret here about who's flying the jets. The FAA keeps records, Homeland Security keeps records, everybody keeps records, who's leaving the contrails, where these planes take off from because they have to file flight pass. It's going to affect agriculture, watersheds, water supplies as it goes this way, because you're going to be putting it in places that don't need it for private gain, commercial gain. Ski resort could have a weather modification over their ski resort, which might take water from somewhere else or snow from some other location. So we need to get Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison's bill, number 601, defeated this year, because it allows anyone to mitigate or modify the weather with very little definition of mitigation in order to do what? So, but all these government agencies would be allowed without congressional oversight or public consent to modify the weather. So what happens to crop production? What happens to normal climates? I became an agriculture crop loss adjuster, which meant that if there were any crops that failed in California for any reason, crop loss adjusters were sent by the state of California to go investigate where these crop losses were and why there were crop losses throughout the state. So I was traveling about 50,000 miles a year around here in this process. Then in early 2000, I began to notice that I would see jets and they would leave these little tiny trails, and then the sky would white out after that. And I was always irritated because our skies used to be so crystal clear and blue and gorgeous, and all of a sudden you would see these jets, and I kind of thought of them almost as joyriding, and when they were, or skyriding, and when they did this, then the sky would haze over. And so I found myself, when I was teaching tennis and being outdoors all the time, or traveling for work, that I was irritated a little bit about the idea that the skies were hazed over a lot. So that was the first inkling. And then flying that day, because there were many going in the same direction, leaving parallel lines. And in subsequent days, I would see many jets flying where the lines were parallel, and there would be 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 all leaving trails at one time.